And Hurricane Irma is coming with a fury seldom seen before. The second most powerful hurricane ever in the Atlantic. It's now churning through the Caribbean with its eye on the U.S. Right now, Irma, a Category 5 hurricane, packing 185-mile-an-hour winds. It is still too early to tell if the monster storm will make landfall in the U.S. On the mainland, but Florida could be in harm's way this weekend. President Trump already declaring emergencies for Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands to help with storm preparations. We will have the full hurricane forecast in just a moment.
Now, the most immediate concern is for people in the northeastern Caribbean. Hurricane Irma hitting the island of Barbuda overnight. A 36-hour curfew has been issued for the entire territory of the U.S. Virgin Islands. The potentially catastrophic storm threatening those islands and others, including Puerto Rico. And that's where CNN's George Howell is this morning. George, good morning to you. What are you seeing there?
Dave, the Caribbean here, these Caribbean islands will be first to feel the effects here of Irma. You mentioned the situation in Barbuda, that island feeling the eye of this storm as it passes by. And as you also mentioned, the U.S. Virgin Islands, 36-hour curfew. We also heard that the Prime Minister of the Bahamas issuing the largest evacuation to ever take place in that nation, all taking place by plane, set to happen through the course of the day. So a lot of preparations happening throughout this region. Also here in San Juan, in Puerto Rico, we understand that the governor has declared a state of emergency, has activated the National Guard, has also ordered a day of voluntary evacuation to the east of the island. Voluntary, I say, but officials urging people to get to higher ground, to get to safer shelter. So the winds are starting to pick up here. It is ominous. You're not going to see my hair whipping around with that, so the best I can show you is the palm trees back there. You get a sense of what's happening, and you can see the surf line in the distance. It's dark, but the winds are picking up. The water getting much more choppy. Again, this storm moving ever so closer to Puerto Rico. So many people here understand this island has seen big storms before. They've never seen anything like this. So it depends upon the course of this storm, if it continues to track just to the north of this island. But again, these things can wobble and shift. So it is right now just a matter of wait and see.
Tenuous times there in Puerto Rico. George Howell reporting for us. Thank you, sir.
And several South Florida counties are operating in emergency mode, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst when and if Hurricane Irma hits. The mayor of Miami-Dade County signing an emergency declaration. They're going to begin evacuating special needs residents today. All county offices, along with schools, they're going to be closed Thursday and Friday. Officials are also expected to issue evacuation orders for Miami Beach later today or early Thursday.
Neighboring Broward County planning to set up dozens of shelters that will be able to accommodate as many as 33,000 people. Broward schools will also be closed Thursday and Friday. In Monroe County, home to Key West, a mandatory evacuation of visitors, tourists, and non-residents takes effect in just a few hours at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. The evacuation of residents begins at 7 p.m. tonight.
Florida Governor Rick Scott ordering the deployment of 7,000 National Guard members, 1,000 high-water vehicles, and more than 700 generators, all of that on standby. The governor suspending tolls across the state. That's going to allow people to move more easily and safely to evacuate. More than 5,000 people based at Naval Air Station Key West, they've received mandatory evacuation orders.
Meantime, Florida residents stocking up storm supplies. Aisles at some stores have been left bare by this mad rush. Lines of people wrapped around the Costco in Pembroke Pines, stocking up on fuel, water, and materials to protect their homes. Also, the NFL's opening weekend also impacted. The Miami Dolphins won't open the season at home. Sunday is scheduled. The league exploring other options for their game against Tampa Bay, including moving it to a neutral site or playing it at a later date, perhaps week 11 during both teams' byes. That will be hard for both teams to pull off.
All right, so the big question everybody is asking, where is Hurricane Irma going to hit the hardest? Meteorologist Pedram Javahiri is tracking the storm. Pedram, what are you seeing right now?
You know, one of the most menacing storms I've ever seen here on satellite imagery. Hard to take your eyes off of this storm as it moved ashore Barbuda in the last couple of hours. Coming ashore now among the strongest tropical systems we've ever observed anywhere on Earth. Approaching Anguilla, areas around St. Martin, St. Bart's. This particular region home to about 100,000 people. And when you think about this region, we're talking about an area that is essentially made up of sandy beaches, very flat terrain, almost entirely for that island. So significant devastation going to be expected across these regions. And I want to show you the eye of the storm as it moved over Barbuda. We had wind gusts of 155 miles per hour. Within 6 minutes, the winds went to calm. The observation point, the gauge, stopped operating as a result. And of course, that is just part of the communication we're losing with some of these islands as the storm moves ashore. But 7 to 11-foot storm surge across this region, up to 20 feet for some of the storm surge on the Turks and Caicos. Again, keep in mind, as flat as a pancake, this would cause significant devastation across these regions. And when you get to a catastrophic Category 5 type storm, we know any landmass that interacts with such a storm, most of this area, historically speaking, is uninhabitable for a period of weeks or months. Communication is typically lost for that same time period. So important things to note as this storm system moves ashore over portions of the Leeward Islands. But the track, I want to follow for you, taking it through the next couple of days. Look what happens as it approaches Cuba, because pretty good forecast guidance at this point on where this will end up by, say, Friday night into Saturday. Beyond that is where it really begins to get tricky. And I want to really emphasize that a lot of people fall in love with the central portion of a track, but the storm certainly could take a southern track on this cone. That's why there's a cone here. And then it also could take a northern track of this as well. So continue to break this down for you with the models here, laying it down. Again, notice the confidence is pretty high here as it approaches Cuba by early this weekend. Beyond that, when the right turn occurs, pretty significant shift. Some of them wanting to take it out towards the west. Notice no model remaining now that wants to bring it into the Gulf of Mexico, but just about every other one wants to bring it in towards the eastern coast of Florida. This is in the last few minutes, and I want to overlay the European model and the also American model, which have historically done a great job with this, at least in recent days with Harvey in tracking that storm. And notice the blue being the European model, the red indicating the American model, almost directly on top of one another as it approaches Cuba. So confidence high that that would occur sometime early this weekend. But notice once again, just slight timing variations. The storm at this point appears to kind of skirt the eastern side of Florida, so potentially a landfall near eastern areas of Florida if this forecast verifies, or taking it up the east coast of Florida into the Carolinas. So we've seen dramatic changes, of course, in the last 24 hours of going from the western side of Florida, and this is going to be expected as we approach the next couple of days, guys.
You know what? It can be either the east coast or the west coast of Florida, and that can make all the difference for those you know, who live in Miami or who live in Fort Myers. So everybody in South Florida watching that. All right, Pedram Javahiri, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hurricane IRMA then expected to reach Florida again based on its present trajectory sometime Saturday. And yet there's another storm forming off the open Atlantic, Jose. How that happens and how busy the season is. So the guy who saw it all coming, Weather 2000 Chief Meteorologist Michael Slachter. Is this an especially busy hurricane season? This is the 10th or 11th named storm? What are we?
Yeah, Jose is our 10th named storm, and we've had some other depressions and prospects, so we could have had 12. But yeah, very active. This is the most active month in the Atlantic hurricane season, so we're not done yet, unfortunately.
All right, so the catalyst seems to be these warmer waters, right?
Yeah, what's interesting, just to add on to that factoid that was mentioned, Irma is actually the strongest hurricane ever in the Atlantic outside of the Caribbean Sea or Gulf of Mexico. So those 4 or 5 storms that have been stronger in history all occurred in the Caribbean Sea or Gulf. So this is actually north of the Caribbean Sea, strongest hurricane ever. It will go through some eye wall replacement cycles, so separate from land, separate from shear. It's very difficult for hurricanes to stay above 170 miles per hour for a long period of time. So it will wane over the next 2 or 3 days, but think about it.
What would make it wane? Is it just that it reforms and...
It runs out of its own fuel, so it kind of has to rebuild itself at this very high intensity. So, but just to protect people from hyped up headlines, let's say you hear the headline, it drops 50 miles per hour. That's still a 130 mile per hour category for a hurricane. So we have to be wary of that.
What would prompt it to slow down to that degree? If it's not land, it's just the nature of the beast?
Yeah, just it kind of can wane down these eye wall replacement cycles, the ebbs and flows, but it doesn't mean that it can't get right back up to high Category 5, Category 4 yet again. Just for Chapter 1 over the next 2 or 3 days, I think it will wane a little bit before it gets towards the Bahamas and Florida.
Now, a lot of people have been talking about its speed, and it's a lot faster than Harvey was, which could be a mixed blessing. It doesn't hang around and leave the type of rains and flooding that a Harvey did, but explain.
Well, it has a lot of inertia with it, but because it's so strong, it has a lot of outflow, and that outflow actually creates a subsiding ridge to its north, and that's one of the reasons why 5 days ago a lot of the computer models said out to sea, Bermuda, or directly up to New England, and it keeps on going further west. So I think people need to be wary, especially in southern Florida, not to think it's going to make this clip. So as it's moving with a full head of steam like a bowling ball, with this subsidence ridge to its north, I really think southern Florida has to keep very, very sharp eyes on this.
When you say sharp eyes on it, do you mean that it's still going to be severe no matter what? There's no possibility that it could just boomerang or turn around or turn tail or go back out into the open Atlantic? I
mean, remember, it's not a dot, it's a disk. Right. So no matter what scenario I see, curving in the Bahamas, going through the Keys and curving in the Gulf, there's no way that part of the disk of Irma doesn't lash the southern quarter of Florida pretty hard. And Florida is a very unique state, unlike some of the other southern states, that has a lot of big population cities right on the water.
Right.
It doesn't need the rain or Lake Okeechobee to flood to cause issues. Just the wind hitting these very high population cities from the Keys all the way up to, let's say, West Palm Beach or Fort Lauderdale, it could be bad news for the state.
So it would hit the coastline, then presumably move up the coastline rather than, I think in Sandy's case, hop over into the Gulf or what have you. What would be the scenario?
Right. So due to the inertia, it very...
I'm sorry, like Katrina, I meant.
Right. It could enter the Gulf of Mexico technically, but I don't see too many scenarios that would allow it to curve not before the state of Florida. So maybe a Tallahassee or Pensacola curve. I really think the Western Gulf is safe according to my analysis now, but no matter what kind of curve it takes, western coast of Florida or eastern coast of Florida, southern Florida and the Bahamas are pretty much in for some bad news right now.
Back to your earlier premise of the busy hurricane season, this is the busiest early on, I guess, we've seen in a dozen years, right? What prompts that, or is that cyclical in nature, or what?
Well, we have obviously some very, very warm ocean temperatures, and prior to Harvey, 2005, 12 years ago, was the last time we saw Category 3 landfalls and all this activity. So there are some cycles, but there obviously is a long-term trend of the oceans warming, and that not only means that storms can get stronger, but as they approach land, they can maintain or even strengthen, as we saw with Harvey. So I'm hoping that's not the case with southern Florida, but if this goes through a cycle and then regenerates in the Straits of Florida, it could be very, very dangerous.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Michael.